Thanks, Neil. It is great to be here, and I applaud BDC for driving this kind of event, because these are the kind of conversations that we absolutely need to have in Canada if we're going to be positioned for the next generation. I'm wearing black today because our sports teams are having challenges, and I'm not actually talking about the Leafs because they haven't even started yet, but my Blue Jays are actually 1-7, which is very distressing. So for any baseball fans, they will come back, but we'll see how the season goes. My apologies for Montreal losing last night. We in Toronto can appreciate it because we know what it's like to have a losing team. So anyway, hopefully the Leafs will do okay tonight. Anyway, so here's what we're going to go through. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of why I'm very excited about the Canadian opportunities in front of us, but I'll also set a little bit of a tone of sense of urgency and the fact that we need to get on with some of the tasks at hand. We talked with Neil when we were preparing for today and making sure that this isn't going to be about lecturing you on all the challenges of the Canadian economy, but it is going to be about stepping on the accelerator in terms of some of the capabilities and opportunities that we have in front of us. So let's get into it. So Canada really is at a crossroads right now. And Kevin Lynch, many of you will know Kevin Lynch, Privy Council member, now Vice Chair at the Bank of Montreal. He's been one of the leading thinkers in Canada on the topic of productivity and innovation over several decades. And Kevin came to one of our leadership meetings about 7 years ago, and he said one sentence that actually changed how we thought about it and how we then focused a bunch of research in this whole area. He said, we're at the first time ever in the history of our country where if we don't change our productivity and innovation agenda, the next generation is going to have a worse quality of life than we do. First time ever in the history of this country, and we're now 150 years young, right? First time ever that if we don't change the productivity agenda, the next generation will have a worse quality of life than we do. So that was actually very impactful for us, and we said we have to actually take that to heart. We created our Future of Canada research program, and so every year we've done quantitative research, Canadian research, so not just leveraging global capabilities, but Canadian research on what are the real root causes of some of the problems and what we've done. I'm not going to go through all of that research today, but suffice it to say, we're very focused on this topic and making sure that our Canadian corporations, our Canadian organizations like the government, and our institutions and academic institutions that are driving the next generation of talent are focused on this. All right. So, are you guys watching this carefully? Okay. Did you see that? So we spent tens of dollars on that particular video. Our marketing department worked very hard. But we're at a very unique time in history where the world, I would say the world, needs more Canada, okay? The world needs more Canada based on our values, based on our capabilities, based on our role in the global economy. And so we're trying to take that seriously and say, how do we make sure that we are waving the flag more? How do we actually celebrate Canadian successes? I think it's amazing that the Governor General and Tom Jenkins are going to be here to showcase their book that's coming out. So Canada has a wonderful history of innovation. We need to celebrate the history, but we also need to look forward and start celebrating the successes and take them forward into the next generation. All right, so we've taken a look at this over the last 7 years, and there's a bunch of facts that we need to recognize and then move on from. Canada consistently underinvests in growth. So part of our job is to help make people understand and make the corporations understand that we have to be putting money back into the economy. We have to be investing in our productivity and innovation, or we're not going to have the same level of competitiveness as we do with other countries. We kind of know at our hearts that we have an aversion to risk. It was fascinating when we did one of our research studies. We asked all the CEOs over 1,200 different companies across Canada to report their risk appetite. And they all said, we're ready to take on risk, we love it. And they reported almost exactly the same level as their US colleagues. When we actually dug underneath the numbers, we said, well, that doesn't really feel right. Doesn't ring true for us. So we actually created a risk behavior index. How much are they investing in R&D? What kind of acquisitions are they doing? How many patents and other things are they? A bunch of drivers of risk appetite. And suddenly Canadian organizations dropped 35%. So we have a deep risk aversion, and we need to get over that. There are lots of organizations like the ones in the room that don't have the same level of risk aversion, but as a country, we have a deeper risk aversion than our U.S. colleagues. And some of the projections for future growth aren't great. So those factors aren't spectacular as we think about where this is going. So when we looked at the latest reason underneath this, we've studied things like our exports, we've studied things like our investment, we've looked at our readiness for exponential technologies, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the technologies today and the growth sectors that we see. The latest research that we did was actually getting into the human dynamic. So it's not just about knowing about the technologies, it's actually about having the courage to do something about it as leaders. And so we studied courage and went through over 700 different companies that we looked at. And you can see here, this is CEOs rating themselves in Canada. And only 11% of our CEOs said they had courageous leadership. This is them rating themselves. And 30% were in what we called the evolving category. Strong aspirations, doing a lot of really good things, but wouldn't yet call themselves truly, fully courageous. And by the way, Deloitte, we would rank ourselves in that evolving category. Okay, so this is important for us because to dominate in this next generation, we're going to have much more courageous leadership. So if you look at this, innovation itself starts with courage, the willingness to do something fundamentally different than others have been doing. So the good news from our perspective, when we looked at the data, the 11%, is interesting, and that's a little disconcerting. We'd love to see that number higher, but I think it's probably a pretty reasonable assessment. We're excited about the 30% because those are the ones that are saying, we're going to take it to the next level. They're working on it. They're making the investments that they need to make, and we'll talk a little bit later about what are some of those steps that need to be undertaken. So that's kind of where we are as a country. So when you think about your organizations, think about how are you taking those courageous steps, and we'll talk at the back end about what some of those are, but how are you making a difference inside your company across geographies. We do a lot of work with the World Economic Forum and around on a global basis, and so they're the guys that bring you Davos. And the World Economic Forum is calling this the fourth industrial revolution. So saying that this is one of the fastest paced changes that we've seen in the history in terms of the technologies that are coming. So let's take a quick peek at where that's going. Sorry, one sec here. Yeah, there we go. I like that video because it gives you that sense of how fast this is going. So the previous industrial revolutions, the big ones, were 50, 60 years long, right? Taking a long time for the kinds of change that happened, and now it's getting much, much faster. If you look at Jack Ma, Jack was at Davos at the World Economic Forum, and he had his 30-30-30 model. And I think it's interesting. So Jack, CEO of Alibaba, one of the biggest growing companies in the world, And he said, they look at big transformations in 50-year chunks. And he starts to look at this industrial revolution and says, we're really only 20 years into it. And that last 20 years has brought us big giants that we see like Apple and Google and Facebook. But we're just at the front end of that 50-year chunk of time. So how do we actually, if we're running our companies, how do we think in 30, 30, 30? So his 30, 30, 30 is, how do you think 30 years out? So what are the kinds of changes and the kind of organization and company that you're going to need to have 30 years from now? So thinking about that, and most of us, we do planning cycles in a 1, 3, maybe a 5-year cycle, but we're not thinking about that 30-year out window. And so he said that's the kind of stuff that Alibaba is starting to think about and how that change happens. His other 30 is thinking about not just your traditional competitors, but who are those nimble, small organizations that have 30 employees or less. So the small, nimble companies, because they can come and disrupt you. We're seeing a lot of the unicorns today, and good news, there's some Canadian unicorns as well, but 30 people or less can have a very meaningful impact in today's economy. And then the last one is the 30-year-old individual, and how do they think? So thinking like a millennial. How do we bring much better thinking into our organizations? And tap into that, not just the folks that have been in the industry a long time, because they're not digital natives, they're not going to think in the same way. So I thought that was a very interesting way of looking at it. And somebody who's driving one of the biggest organizations in the world and fastest growing organizations in the world is thinking about it that way. All right, so living in an exponential world, why is this stuff so hard? Our brains, this is my minor neuroscience lesson for you today, but our brains are trained to think linearly. We actually deal with all the information that we have. We understand a steady stream of core capabilities, improving 5%, 10%, 15% per year. The problem is a lot of the technologies that are coming along are actually on an exponential curve, a true exponential curve. And so, they're 0.01, 0.02, 0.04. The problem is at the front edge of that curve, it looks linear, right? And our brains extrapolate that. We say, okay, that's linear. I get it. AI, it's linear. No problem. And so the problem is if you're planning your company to deal with that technology on a linear path, and your competitor or the disruptor in the startup is actually thinking on an exponential path, that's when you'll be gone. And that's the billion-dollar delta. So you can see the difference between those two. Okay, so let's do a quick little math quiz. Okay, quick little math quiz. And if you've seen this before, please don't answer. So when we go through this and we test it, if you take 30 linear steps down the football field, you go 30 yards. That's not really the quiz. Okay. Now, if you go 30 exponential steps down that same football field, 1 step, 2 steps, 4 steps, 8 steps, 16 steps, how far do you get? End of the football field? Heard around the world, maybe? Anybody else? Bold? Across the street? Did I hear across the street? You go 26 times around the world. 26 times. So if you're honest with yourselves, none of us were able to actually get there unless you might have been a quantum physicist, and those guys seem to understand exponentials. But none of us were really able to get, that's 3 times to the moon, okay? So this is why our brains have trouble with the kind of technologies that are coming at us today, because they're not trained to think in exponential terms. So that's why this is hard to actually fathom and why it's hard to think about in the same way. We've looked at a whole bunch of different sectors, and we've added some. So we did research on the age of disruption a year and a half ago, did a whole bunch of preparedness of Canadian companies, and bad news, a lot of Canadian companies were really not prepared for exponential growth. But these are a number of sectors that are really on that kind of trajectory. And I'm not going to go through all of these today, but these are some of the ones that we are very excited about in Canada that we can go and think about. So artificial intelligence, networks and sensors, clean tech, and that whole space. Biotech and health sciences. Lots of different technologies in each of those sectors that are starting to be much more impactful for our society. And so what we now need to do, and I'm encouraged, I was in Ottawa last week looking at some of the federal government budget implications, and I'm encouraged that we're starting to make choices, right, around where are we going to focus our economy. So let's take a look at some of these. Excuse me. So, if we think about all of these, Ryan Holmes, Hootsuite is a great success story. And Ryan has said, as an ecosystem, we're really starting to reach critical mass and see exponential growth in the years ahead. So in his company, Hootsuite's had fantastic growth. He's seeing that, and he's seeing it in the overall tech sector, and he's a great example of Canadian entrepreneurialism. So let's take a look at a couple of these. So they get talked about a lot, so clean tech, right? Clean tech got overhyped a little bit for a while. Now it's starting to come into its own. And if you look at clean tech 2017, there's over 55,000 people that are employed in Canada in clean tech, right? Projecting out for another few years, 100,000 people that we think will be employed. So a very meaningful sector. By the way, that number, if I have my math correct, in between those two numbers will eclipse the total employees in the U.S. for coal-based powered sessions. There are 70,000 people employed. For all the discussion on bring back the coal and refire up the coal in the U.S., there's only 70,000 people. So we're actually doing some very interesting things in clean tech. If you look at the kind of money in this, over $11 billion in annual revenue this year, and targeting over $50 billion. So lots of very interesting kinds of money being made in this particular space. Over 800 companies that we have. So we need to really double down and make sure that we're getting very focused clean tech kinds of companies. There are lots of, and it's growing at 4 times the average of the Canadian economy. There are lots of interesting startups coming through in this space. How many of you, just a little test of US-Canada focus, how many of you have a Nest thermostat at home? Nest thermostat, okay, there's about 10. How many of you have, a few more, how many of you have an Ecobee thermostat? Okay, it looked like more Nest than Ecobee. So Ecobee, Canadian company, does basically exactly what the Nest can do. Nest, great capability, but Ecobee, Canadian company, we need to be supporting and buying Canadian technology. So Ecobee is the little logo in the middle there. So, simple example of an IoT gadget, but fundamentally part of our energy proposition. So lots of interesting things going on in this particular space. Let's keep going. So artificial intelligence, lots and lots being talked about in artificial intelligence these days. And it's interesting. I'll hesitate to admit that I went to University of Waterloo. I won't hesitate to admit that, but I'll hesitate. I'm very proud of that, by the way. But I'll hesitate to admit that I did it in the 80s. And when I went, there was an AI department in the computer science group. So AI is not a new thing, right? It's not a new thing. It's been around, but it was on that gradual curve, right? And now we're hitting the clip where there are lots of different companies coming along. Canada, and this is where we got to wave the flag, Canada has some of the great pioneers in the whole AI space. So whether it's Geoffrey Hinton coming out of U of T, or Richard Sutton in Alberta, or Joshua Bengio from Montreal. So we have some great Canadian leaders in this space. And we're now starting to say, okay, we actually need to go and drive this out. So the government's getting focused. We have private sector getting focused. Over $125 million getting put into some of the capabilities in this space. Some of our great universities are actually getting much more focused on this as a domain, and not just as a university capability, but also how do they actually integrate with corporations and go and solve great and big business problems. The Vector Institute announcement, hopefully everybody saw that this week. I think it's a great statement around how corporate Canada, academia, and the government can actually combine together to say, we are going to make sure that Canada is a leader in the AI space. In our world at Deloitte, we see automation, the broader capability of automation, really dominating the dialogues that we're having both internally. How do we do AI for our own capabilities, but also what are we doing with our clients? And it's everything from at one end of the continuum, basic automation. You'll hear people talking about robotic process automation through the cognitive space all the way to deep machine learning and AI. And so that entire continuum is what we need to be focused on and make sure that we're preparing Canada for the future. Why I'm excited about this is I think things like the Vector Institute are going to create collaborations that are going to turbocharge our capabilities in the market. And so AI is a big deal, and we should continue to double down on it. As we keep going around the horn in terms of some of the capabilities, biotech and health sciences is huge. If we look at this space, there's over $3.5 billion in the in current revenues in this particular area in Canada, and we're seeing lots and lots of growth by 2020. So it's on the trajectory that we need to drive forward on. It's not one that gets talked about as much as it probably should. If you look at some of the companies that are coming up, a lot of these you wouldn't necessarily have heard about. And everything from the genomic research that we're doing, 23andMe, lots of different things in that capability. I love this little story in the middle. Most of you probably haven't heard of Cloud DX, and it's not per se biotech, but it's in the medical sciences space. Sonny Coley is a doctor from here. I think he's from Hamilton originally. He would go down every year to Haiti and work in Haiti on disaster relief. And he'd go down and see, and he got frustrated because he couldn't serve enough people when he was down in Haiti, and said, it was just inefficient infrastructure. He wanted better technology to do diagnosis. So he started working on technology that would plug into your phone, and he could get heart rates, he could get breathing levels, he could get all kinds of different data just to help him serve people faster. When he came back home and he started working on the technology, somebody said, "Sonny, have you heard of the X Prize?" Peter Diamandis and the guys from Singularity and the X Prize have a tricorder X Prize that's driven toward how can you create a device that's handheld that can fundamentally do 85% of what a doctor can do. I said, under $1,000, handheld device, and the prize was going to be $10 million. He said, what you're doing, just because you wanted to do it, building out your capability, is actually exactly what the X Prize is all about. So he entered the X Prize, and he came this close to winning. He was down to the last 6 teams, and his Cloud DX company is going to launch, hopefully this fall. It'll be available. It'll be able to measure your heart rate, your galvanic skin response, all of your oxygen intake. It'll actually be able to do blood tests for 14 different particular capabilities plugged into an iPhone, and it's going to cost under $300. What he realized was it wasn't actually about the devices and the hardware. It was actually about the algorithms and the AI. So this is where we start to see these areas colliding as well. And so very cool stuff. So watch Cloud DX. It's going to be a very interesting capability. I love the fact also that Watson is actually IBM is putting their health sciences and medical research for Watson in Hamilton. So their center for Watson delivery for biomedical is going to be right beside Hamilton Health Sciences. So you got a hospital, leading edge research hospital, working with IBM with their deep machine learning, and away we go. So interesting stuff from that front. All right, so let's talk about FinTech. So lots of stuff. We have big banks, big insurance companies here in Canada. There's lots of people driving new capabilities into the FinTech space. So we're seeing over 200 companies just in Canada in this particular space, more getting created every day. By the way, we run a database of FinTechs. There's over 10,000 worldwide FinTechs that we're tracking. Now, some of those are just 2 folks in a laptop, but nonetheless, there's some very interesting stuff going on. Lots of different patents coming out in this space, and there's folks trying to both collaborate with the large financial services players, as well as some of them trying to disrupt the financial services players. Because of our financial services community here in Canada, there are a lot of folks that deeply understand this industry, and we're seeing some great examples of the kind of technologies that we're talking about. Over $1 billion of funding is going into this space, 124% per year funding growth. And here's some of the companies that you can start to see. So great companies, whether it's in the risk side of the equation, anti-money laundering, whether it's in wealth management, peer-to-peer payments, all kinds of different spaces. And we need to continue to make this a vibrant focus for Canada. So lots of stuff going on in the FinTech space. Cybersecurity, this is an interesting one, and we've been following. It was conspicuously absent, actually, in the government's recent budget. They weren't really talking about cyber as a space. Canada is well known as being a safe harbor in many ways, and we should be building on that. We're actually the 4th largest hub when you think about different jurisdictions around the world. And we did a research study with the TFSA last year. And if you look at where the venture capital, where's the money going? The money's going into, as you would expect, Silicon Valley, then into Israel, to Tel Aviv and the area there, and Jerusalem. And then just passing us as we were doing the research was London. So we were actually 3rd when we did the first set of the research, and by the time the research finished, we were 4th in venture capital. So we have a strong place, but the rest of the world is waking up, and cyber, as we're seeing in everything from how governments and elections are run to our own identity safety, is something that's going to be very important as we go forward. So Canada needs, I would say, and this is sort of Terry's opinion, not official Deloitte opinion, but we need to really double down on this and create a center of excellence where we're driving more and more of this capability. Over $250 million is put into Canadian venture capital into the cyberspace, so it's getting money, but it really needs to be stepping up to the next level in terms of how we go at that, excuse me, that whole sector. There's interesting companies here, and I love things like SecureKey. So this is serial entrepreneurs that have done a lot of things, Greg Wolfen and the team, a lot of things over history in Canada, and they're actually getting the banks to collaborate with one another and say, hey, here's something where we can go after how do we actually manage fraud and identification in our ecosystem. So that's awesome. Got a chance to meet with the folks at BioConnect. These guys are interesting. So they're doing biometric technology. So everything from measuring my voice and recognizing me with my voice, with my thumbprint, with my iris and eye print, or my facial recognition. So imagine getting rid of all of your cards and being able to have different levels of security. So if I'm with my bank and I actually am just checking my balance, maybe that's just my voice, right? If I'm actually going through and doing a larger transaction payment, maybe it's voice plus iris, etc. So they're thinking hard about what the next generation of authentication is going to be in that space, and they're doing some interesting things on a global basis. So lots of different stuff here, and you can see the universities again playing an important role. But I think cybersecurity, we need to figure out where's the home for cybersecurity and how do we make sure that Canada is on the map in terms of other jurisdictions. So those are just, a flyby of some of the core areas that we're looking at in terms of the technologies. My message to you as we sit here today is we've spent a lot of time as Canadians talking about the role of government. Government just needs to step up, and they need to change their R&D legislation, or they need to open up immigration, or they need to do something for us or create another incubator. My point to you is we, and I say we because I put Deloitte directly in this bucket, we as corporate Canada have an absolutely essential role, in fact a duty, to really help scale our businesses, really become globally competitive. So we need to step up, and our research has said that on average, our companies are not investing sufficiently, whether it's in automation, whether it's in new products and services. We need to step up to actually jump on this bandwagon. And there's a few different aspects to it. You heard a bit about corporate venturing yesterday, and you'll hear more about incubators and clusters. We need to be actually not just working inside our own companies. We need to be working very dynamically with others that are peers or in other parts of our industry. And we need to be very actively helping bring forward Canadian startups. When I travel to the incubators and accelerators or see the startups across the country, the number one point they make is not about money. A lot of people talk about venture capital. We need more money and we need to change our venture capital. It's not actually about that. They need clients, right? They need you and I and us in the room to be their clients. Most of the ones I talk to, and it doesn't matter which industry or sector they're in, they say, I can go over to Sweden and sell a system over there on transportation or on AI or on something else, and I can't sell it here in my backyard. So we need to actually have a little bit more of the buy Canadian kind of mentality of how do we help them grow. They still need to be world class. They still need to have the best capabilities, but they need us to be stepping up, excuse me, to deal with that. Ultimately, if we do these things properly, it's going to grow our own businesses, it's going to grow our economy, and it's going to help solve that problem of the next generation. So as we look at that, there's a few things that we need to do. One of the things in my world of innovation that we spend a lot of time on is ecosystems. And it's a fancy 25-cent buzzword. But the reality is ecosystems are becoming science now. It's no longer art and just the kind of things that you do. You need to be thinking very actively about what is your ecosystem. So which universities are you connected with? Which incubators are you connecting with? How are you going outside your geography to understand and learn from others? So this is really, really good. It's a nice, pretty picture, but it's actually really good. And we've done a ton of research at the Center for the Edge down in Silicon Valley. So John Hagel and John Seely Brown. John Seely Brown was the guy that created Xerox PARC, for those of you that are kind of tech geeks, so the Palo Alto Research Center. And he's done a ton of research on different types of ecosystems. So this is no longer, hey, I go out and meet with a bunch of people and that's kind of what I do. You have to manage it very differently. So I have a guy on my team who's here today, Brandon Riddell. His job is sensing an ecosystem manager. So he helps us think about how do we find the stuff going on out there? How do we bring it back in? How do we decide companies that we're going to connect with? How do we decide ones that we're going to take out to our clients? How do we decide some that we might want to acquire? We think deeply about that, and we go outside of our borders, because it doesn't matter how many, we have 8,000 people in Canada, 250,000 worldwide. It doesn't matter how many bright people we have. There's even brighter people elsewhere. And I would say the same is true for most of you. So how do you connect in with these Canadian ecosystems? So how many of you have been to Communitech? Most of this crowd. Okay, we got a converted crowd. That's good. So Glenn and a few of the other guys, good job. 111? A few less, okay. How about Catalyst 137? I'm cheating a little bit here. Couple folks. So at Waterloo, they're expanding beyond the Communitech hub. They're building a data hub. Catalyst 137 is going to be an amazing spot. It's going to be focused on smart cities and automation. So they've got folks like Local Motors. Local Motors does the design. They're a design company. They do the design of some of the new cars. If you've seen Ollie, these self-driven transportation vehicles, those are the guys that are doing it. So they're going to be inside Catalyst 137. Hopefully that area becomes part of our autonomous vehicle space, right? And figuring out how do we bring Canadian technology to the forefront there. So lots of things on Canada, and it's important to be connecting with those, but we live in a global world, and it's actually not enough even to be connected in with those. So how do you actually get out and connect with on a global basis? These are a handful of the ones that we deal with. So if you think about MIT Media Lab, if you think about Plug and Play, a number of Canadian organizations are starting to figure out that something like Plug and Play is important to connect into Silicon Valley. Thinking about going over to Israel. How many have been to Israel? Okay, a good group. So it's really important. When I went over to Israel 2 years and change ago, there were no Canadian companies there, or at least no visible Canadian companies. Maybe some of you had stealth operations. But it's really important. That's the startup nation. There are amazing things going on there, whether it's in transportation, and if you followed the Mobileye acquisition by Intel, they were doing really interesting stuff in accident prevention, and they got bought by Intel. So there's some wicked companies in Israel, and we need to build bigger bridges, whether it's financial services companies to Israel, auto manufacturers to Israel, et cetera. So I'm encouraged to see that a lot of that's starting to happen. We do a lot of work with Singularity University. Singularity is a think tank down in Palo Alto, founded by Ray Kurzweil, Peter Diamandis, and a few big thinkers. And so they bring the best of exponential technologies to bear and help clients think about it. So they have 1-week sessions. We created a 4-day session that we do. There are now verticalized sessions. One of the things that we're trying to do is make sure that we bring singularity to Canada. So I'll talk about it at the end. We're having them come up for 2.5 days in October here in Toronto, 1,000 people. And so bringing a lot of that thinking here, as well as some of our Canadian leadership. So connect in. The bottom line of this is if you're driving innovation at your corporation, think about how you're connecting outside of the company and how you're making sure that you're bringing all those things back in. But you have to be serious about it. It's not just about a nice trip somewhere and attend a conference. You have to actually have it built into the discipline of your organization. As we looked at the courage, we started to think about this is a very exciting year for us. So Canada's 150th. First time I learned the word sesquicentennial. Just kind of rolls off the tongue, sesquicentennial. But so it's very excited that we're having our 150th. But the trick and the question is, I like the history, and I think we can learn a lot from the history, but we actually have to learn and see what we're doing going forward. So for us, it's actually, we started a program looking at Canada at 175. So what kind of country do we want to have in the next 25 years, and what do we have to do to create it? So some of the research from our Courage report is think about the challenging route. What's not the easy way forward, but what's the new and challenging thing that we need to do? How do we make key investments that might not pay off just this year? A lot of us are under pressures. Everybody's under the do more with less kind of budget deal. How do you make some of those courageous bets that may take 2 or 3 years to pay off? And how do you make sure that your leadership is thinking about that? If you're a global multinational, how do you make sure that Canada has a footprint, a material footprint, and isn't just a sales office for you? So lots of different things on that. Short-term challenge versus long-term opportunity. We way too often only take that short-term opportunity and the thing that's going to pay off this year. So we need to be thinking much longer. If you think back to Jack Ma, he's thinking in 50-year horizons. He's actually having conversations in his company around what his organization's going to look like 30 years out. We just did a zoom out and zoom in exercise. So we're trying to think about, in this world of disruption, how do you fundamentally change things? And we did a zoom in, zoom out exercise with one of the banks. And we said, let's talk about what your bank really looks like and feels like in 2030. And that's only 13 years out. But do you have a bank? Is it just ubiquitous in terms of how we operate? The margins have gone to zero on a whole bunch of the products. The technology is just pervasive, and yet we still are people. We want to interact with folks. So very challenging things. And that organization hadn't actually thought about it that far out. We're working in 1 to 2 to 3 year timing horizons. So I think stretching out those time horizons is beneficial for us. We still need to get stuff done and deliver real results today, but thinking in a longer horizon is beneficial. And ultimately making some bold decisions. So those are kind of some of the essence that we have. And at the end of the day, remember, the world needs more Canada. We need to be waving that Canadian flag. And here's a note, the final note on the Singularity Canada Summit. I'm excited. They've done summits around the world. This is going to be the first full one. We had them in for a 1-day session 2.5 years ago. And so have your chance. This is my minor plug. We're one of the many founders. We have several other founders with us. This program is run by alumni of Singularity, so it's Canadian alumni that run it. And it's going to be exciting in terms of helping us continue along the trajectory. That's what I have for you today.
Terrific. So great overview of opportunities and challenges in Canada. That's our theme this morning, in case you had missed it. Today's the Canada Day, so the whole thread through the day will be that. Terry's agreed to take a couple of questions, and we do have a couple of minutes for that. Do we have questions from the audience on anything that Terry's raised? Oh, sorry, back table. Glen, I believe.
Hi, Terry. I got Glen Smith with Biotech. I got stuck on one of your first, the survey around courageousness. And 1/3 of organizations are on the cusp of becoming courageous through inspiring and enabling their workforce. And I thought to myself, I bet Terry and Deloitte has some ideas on how that can happen. Can you share a little bit with us about how Deloitte sees organizations being able to enable that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the report is available online, by the way, at the Future of Canada, or if you look up Courage, I think you'll get it. It is all about action. So what we looked at when you move from evolving to actually courageous, it's about placing those bold visions. So number one, articulate the clear and bold vision. Number two, and this is, it sounds trite, but walk the talk. Like, what are you actually doing? How are you getting out of as a leader, how are you getting out of your comfort zone? So are we placing bold statements and taking opinions? And I think, I'll try not to get political too much as we go through this, but we're going to be living in an era where values, I think, are going to become more and more important and harder to find in people. So thinking about how do you express the values that you and your organization stand for? How do you demonstrate them in the acts that you have and the commitments that you make? So things like the Vector Institute, the companies that are saying, hey, this is important for Canada. I may not get an obvious ROI in year 1 or 2, but I'm going to sign up for a 10-year commitment. Those are some of the kinds of things, and there's more examples in the discussion. It's also good to really explore with others and have the dialogue around courageous leadership and tell stories about organizations that you see making courageous bets. Because one of the things that we see in Canada is we're a humble nation, generally speaking, so we don't brag about stuff as much as our neighbors to the south or others do. We need to tell more Canadian success stories, and even in this topic, we need to tell great stories about companies making courageous bets. As we hear more of those stories, we will get more comfortable with our risk aversion. Okay, there's other guys down the road doing courageous stuff, maybe I should do it too. I'm hoping that we get as courageous as we have been with hockey and the Olympics. So if we have an Own the Podium campaign for the economy and some of the exponential technologies, that's the kind of courage and leadership and commitment that I think we need.
Great. Yes, Jim. Last question. We got 2 minutes.
There's just one question. I heard from many speakers during this gathering that Canadians are risk averse. So I'm just wondering, is there something indigenous about Canada with this respect? Is it the weather? Is it because we are all coming from different regions just looking for a better life, or what? So is there something that we can really look at in depth to say that's why, and that's how we can correct it?
Yeah, it's a very deep question or problem. We've looked at it, and there's not a single root cause to it. It can be how we've managed our governments over the years and some of the stuff that's built into our DNA. It's the values that we have. So we're a society that's built on fairness and not on greed, as one example, right? And those things sort of permeate themselves through. When we did our very first piece of research, we looked at how do you actually tackle the problem. So if you've got risk-averse leaders here, risk-averse corporations, et cetera, how do you actually fix it? And there were actually 8 steps across the journey that you need to tackle, and you need to tackle everything from our immigration, some of the stuff we talked about, macro things like immigration. We have to bring more aggressive entrepreneurs and people into the country. But what's interesting to me is one of the very first and most essential components was actually education. Back to our K-12 education, we need to get people taking on more risks. We need to get people doing more creative things. We need to get them thinking and understanding that failure is actually okay. And in fact, for true innovation, it's essential. So there's a lot of work that needs to go on in the K-12 system as well as it moves through. And there are a number of nice initiatives that are starting to tackle that, but we need to do it at a much more systematic way. We don't have the silver bullet. There are many many levers that we need to push on. And it's interesting, the financial crisis, there are things that reinforce our risk aversion. So financial crisis, we hadn't extended ourselves as aggressively into derivatives and other things, and our economy did pretty well. Some would say, well, regulators did a great job of it. Others would say, no, we're just really good business leaders. At the end of the day, some of the risk aversion, because we were slower to push on some of those, helped with the level of resiliency that we had. So I think if you look at it more programmatically, K-12 education, how do we build the values of entrepreneurialism into people at a young age, that it's not a bad thing to want to become an entrepreneur? We went through a stage where it was a bad thing to do that, the dot-com sort of bust. Now I think, we're starting to build that back in, so that would be a piece of it. I don't think it's because of our cold, but we'll see if there's some other research. Maybe the big data folks could come up with some analysis for me on that one.
That's great. Thank you, Terry.
Thanks.
I really appreciate it.